The restaurant hummed with the kind of quiet elegance that made ordinary people feel like they needed to whisper. Crystal glasses caught the candlelight and threw tiny rainbows across white tablecloths. Imani Carter moved between the tables with the practiced grace of someone who had learned to make herself small, not because she was, but because the job required it. She had been working the Friday evening shift for 7 months now, and she knew every table, every regular, every trick the kitchen used to make the food look more expensive than it was. She was good at this. She was good at everything she tried. That was the tragedy of it. She spotted the new party being seated at table 9, the best table in the house, tucked beside the floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the city lights. A man and a woman. The man arrived first, pulling out the chair for his companion with the kind of theatrical chivalry that was more performance than feeling. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than 3 months of Imani's rent. His fiancée, Imani could see the ring from across the room, was stunning, the kind of woman who made other women quietly assess themselves. They settled in with the ease of people who had never once worried about a bill. Imani tucked her notepad under her arm and approached, her smile the same warm, professional one she had practiced until it felt natural. "Good evening," she said. "Welcome. My name is Imani and I'll be taking care of you tonight. Can I start you off with something to drink while you look over the menu?" The woman smiled back briefly, already reaching for the menu. The man, Damien she would learn later, looked at Imani the way people look at furniture. Not rudely exactly. Just with complete absence of recognition that she was a full human being. He picked up his menu without a word, and something in Imani's chest tightened the way it always did when she felt it, that quiet, deliberate erasure. Damien Cole had built his fortune from nothing, which was either admirable or dangerous depending on who was telling the story. He had clawed his way up through real estate and investment with a ferocity that left little room for softness. Tonight, however, he was not thinking about business. He was thinking about Vanessa. Vanessa, who had laughed a little too long at her colleague's joke last Tuesday. Vanessa, who had mentioned 3 times this week how brilliant Marcus was. Damien had said nothing because Damien never said anything vulnerable out loud. Instead he performed. He dazzled. He reminded the room and Vanessa exactly who he was. He scanned the menu with only half his attention. The other half was on Vanessa, cataloging every small gesture she made. She was beautiful and sharp and she challenged him, which was why he had proposed. But lately he felt a subtle shift, a loosening in how she looked at him, and it made him anxious in a way he disguised as arrogance. He decided tonight needed a moment. Something that would remind Vanessa why she had said yes. He needed to be impressive. He needed an audience. The waitress was still hovering at the edge of their table, patient and polite. His eyes moved to her slowly, an idea forming, small and mean the way small mean ideas always are, at the back of his mind. He leaned back in his chair and glanced at Vanessa with a hint of a private smile. Then he turned to Imani and, in a language most linguists would struggle to identify, a medieval dialect of Old Provençal, the kind studied only in very specific doctoral programs, he said something that translated roughly to, "Bring me the lamb and try not to spill it on yourself since that uniform is already doing you no favors." It was obscure. It was precise. It was exactly the kind of move designed to perform sophistication while landing a humiliation that flew over every head in the room, except, he assumed, the waitress's. He waited for the blank stare. The flustered apology. The small, satisfying proof of his superiority. The dining room did not notice. The surrounding tables continued their conversations, their laughter, their quiet clinking of silverware. Vanessa raised an eyebrow, already looking faintly amused. She had studied abroad, picked up enough French to catch the performance without catching the content. She thought it was charming. She reached for her wine. Damien kept his gaze on Imani, waiting, wearing that patient half-smile that rich men wear when they already know the punchline. Imani heard every word. Her mind processed them the way a musician processes a wrong note, instantly, automatically, without drama. She stood completely still for exactly 2 seconds. 2 seconds where the entire shape of the interaction rearranged itself in her understanding. She knew that dialect. She had spent 18 months studying medieval Romance linguistics as part of her doctoral research at one of the most rigorous language programs in the country, before she had withdrawn to come home and sit beside her father's hospital bed and work double shifts to keep the lights on. Old Provençal was practically a personal language to her. She had written 40 pages on its grammatical irregularities. She looked at Damien Cole with calm, clear eyes. And then she replied, in flawless, precisely conjugated Old Provençal, saying, "Of course. And just so you know, the verb you used in the second clause was incorrectly declined. The archaic form requires the subjunctive mood there. I would also suggest the branzino over the lamb tonight. The lamb came in late and the chef isn't pleased with it." She finished with a pleasant smile, clicked her pen and waited. The table went absolutely silent. Vanessa slowly set down her wine glass. Damien Cole's expression did not collapse. Men like him never let their expressions collapse. But something behind his eyes shifted violently, like a shelf giving way in a dark room. Vanessa looked at Imani with an expression that moved through surprise, delight, and then a very specific kind of admiration that women give other women when they've watched something brave happen. "I'm sorry," she said, setting her menu down completely. "Did you just correct his grammar? In Old Provençal?" Imani kept her smile professional. "I did. He used the wrong mood in the subordinate clause. It's a common error. It doesn't appear in most modern translations, so unless you've worked with the original manuscripts, you'd have no reason to catch it." Vanessa turned to look at Damien with an expression that was perfectly composed but absolutely lethal. Damien reached for his water glass. His jaw was set. He was not a man who lost, and he was especially not a man who lost in front of a woman he was trying to impress, to a waitress in a black apron, in a language he had spent 6 months studying with a private tutor specifically to deploy in exactly this kind of moment. His tutor had never once mentioned that anyone might respond. He had assumed mastery through obscurity. It had not occurred to him, and this was the particular sting of it, that the obscurity was the problem. That someone had gone deeper than he had. He recovered quickly. Men like Damien always do. "Impressive," he said flatly, making the word sound like a door closing rather than a compliment. "What are you doing here?" Imani understood the question beneath the question. The real one, the unkind one, the one that meant, "Why is someone like you in a uniform serving someone like me?" She had been asked it before in different forms. She chose the cleanest answer, the one that gave nothing away. "Taking your order," she said pleasantly. "Shall I give you a few more minutes?" Vanessa made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Damien said nothing. Imani left the table with her spine perfectly straight. The rest of the evening passed with a cold professionalism between Imani and Table 9. She brought their drinks, their appetizers, their entrees. All perfectly timed, nothing to complain about. Damien did not speak to her again except to give terse, clipped orders. Vanessa, by contrast, had become warm and attentive in the way people become when they feel they owe someone a small debt of courtesy. She asked Imani if the chocolate dessert was worth it. Imani told her honestly that it was extraordinary. Vanessa ordered 2. After the meal, as Imani was clearing a nearby table, she noticed Damien and Vanessa speaking in low, tense voices. Not fighting, they were too polished for fighting in public, but the geometry of the conversation was wrong. Vanessa's shoulders were angled away. Damien's hand was on the table, not reaching for hers. Imani looked away. Whatever was happening at Table 9 was not her business. She carried the dishes back to the kitchen and told herself that. When she returned to collect the bill, Vanessa was alone at the table. Damien had gone to take a call, apparently. Vanessa looked up at Imani and said, quietly and without preamble, "You didn't deserve what he tried to do. I want you to know that I know that." Imani paused. She looked at this woman, beautiful, composed, engaged to a man who used languages as weapons, and felt a complicated tenderness. "Thank you," she said simply. Vanessa pressed a folded bill into her hand. It was 5 times the standard tip. Imani stared at it. Vanessa was already gathering her coat. Damien did not sleep well that night. He lay in his enormous apartment and stared at the ceiling and felt the unusual, unwelcome sensation of having been outmatched. He was not accustomed to it. He had been outmaneuvered by competitors before, in boardrooms and negotiations, but this was different. This was a waitress. This was someone who should have been powerless in that exchange. The fact that she wasn't bothered him in a way he couldn't fully explain to himself, and because he couldn't explain it, he did what powerful, insecure men do with feelings they can't manage. He transformed the feeling into something actionable. He called his assistant the next morning and asked for the name of the restaurant manager. The manager of that restaurant was a cautious, nervous man named Gerald who had worked in high-end hospitality for 20 years and understood that his job depended entirely on the happiness of wealthy clients. When Damian Cole, whose name Gerald absolutely recognized, called personally to lodge a complaint about a member of staff, Gerald did not ask many questions. He listened carefully to Damian's version of events, which was polished and vague and implied behavior that had never occurred. Attitude, disrespect, making a client feel uncomfortable, a certain tone. Damian was masterful at this. He knew exactly how much pressure to apply and exactly which words to use. By mid-morning, Gerald had pulled Imani's file. By afternoon, he had written her up with a formal warning that cited disrespectful engagement with a patron and failure to maintain appropriate professional conduct. He felt a little sick doing it if he was honest with himself. He had watched the Table 9 interaction from across the room and seen nothing of the sort. But the complaint was formal, and Damian Cole's name carried weight that Gerald's conscience did not. Imani was called into his office at the end of her shift and handed the warning without explanation of the complaint's specific origin. Just the smooth, terrible language of institutional paperwork telling her she had done something wrong. Imani read the warning letter standing in Gerald's office. She read it slowly, the way she read everything, thoroughly looking for what was actually being said beneath what was written. Gerald could not meet her eyes. She noticed that. She set the letter on his desk and said very calmly, "Can you tell me specifically what I did?" Gerald cleared his throat. He said there had been a complaint about attitude. Imani asked if the complaint was from Table 9. A long pause. Gerald said the complaint was from a valued patron. Imani felt the situation assemble itself completely in her mind, all its pieces clicking into place like a sentence she already understood. She thought about her father, who was recovering slowly but still needed medication every week. She thought about the rent and the health bills she had organized by due date on a spreadsheet on her phone. She thought about the apartment and her 2 younger sisters who visited on weekends and whom she would not let see her afraid. She thought about all of it in the span of about 4 seconds. Then she picked the letter back up, folded it carefully and put it in her apron pocket. "I understand," she said. She walked out of Gerald's office and finished the remainder of her shift with impeccable composure, because falling apart at work was a luxury she had not been able to afford for a very long time. In the staff break room afterward, her co-worker and closest friend at the restaurant, a warm, perceptive woman named Kezia, watched Imani pull on her coat with the kind of controlled quietness that Kezia knew meant something bad had happened. "Talk," Kezia said simply, handing her a cup of coffee. Imani told her everything from the old Provençal to the formal warning, and Kezia listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Imani valued most about her. When Imani finished, Kezia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He can't do that." Imani said, "He just did." Kezia said, "Then we have to do something about it." Imani said nothing. She was already thinking. 2 days passed. Imani worked her shifts and smiled at her tables and gave no indication to anyone that anything had shifted beneath her. But in the hours between shifts, on the bus home, in the kitchen at night while her soup was heating, she turned the situation over carefully in her mind. She had worked too hard and sacrificed too much to let her record at this job be tarnished by a man whose only injury was his ego. She began quietly documenting everything. Dates, times, the exact exchange at Table 9. She wrote it all out with the same precision she had once used for academic footnotes, because precision was how she protected herself. On her day off, she went to the library, not because she didn't have internet access, but because the library was still the place that felt most like herself, the self she had been before the uniform. She sat at a table surrounded by books on employment law and worker protections and read for 4 hours. She was not panicking. She was preparing. There was a significant difference. By the time she left, she had identified 3 separate violations in how the formal warning had been handled. Improper process, no direct evidence cited, no opportunity to respond before documentation. She wrote them all down in the same small leather notebook she had carried since her first day of graduate school. The following morning, she arrived at work an hour early and asked to speak with Gerald before the floor opened. Gerald looked immediately and visibly uncomfortable, which told her everything she needed to know about how confident he was in the warning he had issued. She sat across from him and presented her notes, not aggressively, not emotionally, but with the same methodical clarity she had once used to present research to a dissertation committee. She cited the specific internal HR policies that had been bypassed. She stated clearly that she would be filing a formal rebuttal and requesting a review. Gerald stared at her for a long time. He had completely underestimated her, which was a mistake people made regularly and never seemed to learn from. That same morning, a man named Elias Fontaine arrived at the restaurant for a breakfast reservation. He was not the kind of man who announced himself. He was quiet and tall, with a stillness about him that made rooms reorganize subtly around him without most people understanding why. He was one of the most successful business architects in the country, not a celebrity, not a flashy public figure, but the kind of man whose name made other powerful men sit up straighter. He had heard about the restaurant from a colleague and had come specifically to try the branzino, which, ironically, was the same dish Imani had recommended 2 nights earlier at table 9. He was seated in Imani's section. He looked at the menu briefly and then set it down and looked around the room with the attentive, unhurried observation of someone who is always learning from wherever they are. When Imani approached his table, he looked at her directly, not through her, not past her, but at her, with a quality of attention that she noticed immediately because it was uncommon. "Good morning," she said. "Can I start you with coffee?" He said yes and then asked what she recommended. She told him about the branzino and why, and he listened with the kind of focus usually reserved for important meetings. He ordered the branzino. When she brought the food, he asked, almost conversationally, if she enjoyed working there. It was an unexpected question. Most people didn't ask. Imani paused just long enough for it to be honest. "I'm good at it," she said carefully. "That's a diplomatic answer," he said. She smiled slightly. "It's an accurate one." He nodded, seeming to file that away. She left him to his meal. He ate slowly and read nothing and watched the room, and twice she caught him watching her specifically, not with anything inappropriate but with the look of someone assembling information. It made her curious and slightly on edge, and she couldn't decide which of those feelings was more appropriate. By the time Elias Fontaine was finishing his coffee, Gerald had emerged from the back office looking somewhat rattled. He had received a call, apparently, and whoever was on the other end had asked specific questions about staff and management practices. Gerald was not handling it gracefully. Kezia caught Imani's eye from across the room and mouthed the words, "What is happening?" and Imani gave a small shrug that meant, "I don't know, but I'm watching." The restaurant was filling up with the late morning crowd, and the normal rhythm of service was covering whatever undercurrent was moving through the back of the house. Elias called Imani over when she passed with the coffee pot. He asked for the check, and when she brought it, he said, again with that same plain, direct quality, "I overheard part of a conversation when I arrived this morning. Between you and the manager. I wasn't trying to listen." The office door was open. Imani went very still. She waited. He continued, "You handled yourself with extraordinary composure. And the argument you made was correct. I know a fair amount about employment procedure." He handed back the check folder with the bill inside. "I left my card in there. Not because I have an agenda. Because I think you deserve better options than you currently have." Imani opened the folder after he left. The tip was generous, not extravagant but genuinely generous, the kind left by someone who understood the value of the work. And beneath it was a simple card. No flashy logo. Just a name, a number, and a title that made her read it twice. She stood beside table 7 holding that card for a long moment. Kezia appeared at her elbow. "Who was that?" Imani showed her the card. Kezia looked at it, looked at Imani, looked back at the card. "Imani," she said slowly. "That man runs half the businesses in this city." Imani put the card carefully into the same pocket as her folded leather notebook. "I know," she said quietly. She did not call the number for 5 days. It wasn't that she doubted. It was that Imani Carter did not make moves out of desperation. She made them out of clarity, and she needed to be completely clear before she reached out to a man she did not know who operated at a level she had not been part of for 2 years. She spent those 5 days working her shifts, pushing forward her HR rebuttal, calling her father every evening, and lying in her small apartment at night thinking carefully about what she wanted. Not what she needed. What she actually wanted. She had not asked herself that question in a long time. She also did something she hadn't done in months. She pulled out her dissertation files. She had backed them up obsessively on multiple drives, because they represented years of work she hadn't been able to bring herself to delete even when she withdrew from the program. She read through her own writing and felt the strange double sensation of recognizing herself in it, brilliant, thorough, genuinely passionate, and simultaneously feeling like she was reading about someone who lived on the other side of a river she had crossed in the wrong direction. She closed the files. She opened them again the next night. By the fourth night she had added 14 new pages. On the fifth morning she called the number. Elias Fontaine answered on the second ring, which surprised her. She had expected an assistant. She said her name. There was a brief pause, not confusion but recognition. He said, "I was wondering when you'd call." She said, "I needed to think first." He said, "That's a good habit." They arranged to meet the following Wednesday for coffee, not in the restaurant where she worked, but in a quiet place he suggested that she verified was exactly what it appeared to be before she agreed to go. She was careful like that now. She had learned to be. Meanwhile, Damien Cole was having a week that was not going the way he had designed. Vanessa had been distant since Friday. Not cold. Vanessa was never overtly cold, but that specific variety of warm but far that felt worse. She had canceled their Tuesday dinner, citing work, and when he called she answered quickly and spoke briefly, and her voice had the slightly elevated politeness of someone managing rather than connecting. He knew what it meant. He had heard that tone before in business when a deal was quietly walking out the door. He just had never heard it from her. He found himself, absurdly, thinking about the waitress. Not about her, not like that, but about the moment. Replaying it. He had expected blankness. He had gotten something that was almost the opposite of blankness. Absolute, unhurried certainty. The way she had corrected him had not been triumphant or aggressive. It had been precise and calm, and somehow that was worse than if she had been angry. Anger he could have used against her. Calm like that had no handle on it. He just sat there being right. He disliked admitting to himself how much the moment had cost him. He disliked it so much that he doubled down, which is what he always did. He called the restaurant again. This time he pushed harder. He told Gerald that the formal warning was insufficient and that he expected more decisive action, that if the restaurant wanted his continued patronage and the patronage of his considerable network, they would take the matter seriously. Gerald went even quieter on the phone than he had the first time. Damien interpreted the silence as compliance. He should not have. Gerald, in fact, was sitting at his desk looking at Imani's written rebuttal, which was 12 pages long and cited 7 specific policy violations and was the most thorough and precise complaint he had ever received from a junior staff member, and he was beginning to understand that he was standing between a very powerful man and a very dangerous argument. The meeting with Elias Fontaine on Wednesday morning was nothing like what Imani had prepared herself for. She had anticipated something transactional, a job offer perhaps, or a pitch of some kind wrapped in pleasantries. What she got was a conversation. A real one. Elias asked about her background with the genuine curiosity of someone who was actually interested, and when she mentioned her doctoral research, his attention sharpened in the way academic attention always sharpens around specificity. He asked what her dissertation was on. She told him, the structural evolution of medieval Romance dialects and their influence on legal language in early European courts. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's extraordinary." She told him, because something about his straightforwardness made her own straightforwardness feel safe. About her father's illness, the decision to withdraw the past 2 years. She told it factually without seeking pity, the way she would describe a chapter of a book. He listened without offering the automatic sympathetic sounds people usually make, which was respectful in a way she appreciated. When she finished he said, "What do you want to do now?" And she realized he was the second person to ask her that this week, the first being herself. She told him the truth, she wanted to go back. She wanted to finish. And she wanted, in the meantime, to not be erased. Elias nodded slowly. He told her he chaired the board of an academic trust that offered re-entry funding for postgraduate scholars who had interrupted their studies. He told her he also had 2 companies that were in urgent need of someone with exactly her kind of linguistic and analytical intelligence, and that he had spent 40 years watching talent go to waste because systems were not built to catch it. He was not offering charity. He was presenting facts. He said, "I would like to formally connect you with both opportunities if you're interested. You would be in control of how you respond to each one." Imani looked at this quiet, careful man across the table and thought, he means exactly what he says. "Yes," she said. "I'm interested." Back at the restaurant, the pressure Damien had applied was beginning to create cracks, but not in the direction he intended. Gerald, increasingly uncomfortable, had escalated the situation to the restaurant's corporate HR team, primarily to protect himself. The corporate team, looking at Imani's rebuttal, had a very different reaction than Gerald anticipated. They requested a meeting with her. They also quietly began pulling records on the formal warnings issuance process. Kezia, who somehow always knew everything that was happening in any building she occupied, reported all of this to Imani in the break room with the detailed accuracy of a very well-placed intelligence operative. Imani attended the corporate HR meeting with the same leather notebook and the same systematic calm. She answered every question clearly and completely. She did not perform outrage. She did not beg. She simply laid out, fact by fact, what had occurred at Table 9, what she had said, what she had not said, the absence of any actual misconduct, and then laid out, procedure by procedure, how the warning had been issued improperly. The HR representative, a composed woman named Adrian, listened with an expression that grew increasingly careful as the meeting continued. By the end, Adrian had asked Imani if she would be willing to provide a written testimony. Imani said she already had one prepared. She slid a copy across the table. That evening, Imani sat in her apartment with the dissertation files open again. She had been writing every night now, an hour, sometimes two. It was not going to complete itself quickly, she understood that, but the act of returning to it was changing something in her. She was remembering, at a cellular level, what she was actually made of. She called her father and told him about the corporate HR meeting, keeping her voice light and confident even when he worried. She told him it was going to be fine. After she hung up, she stared at the ceiling for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and wrote 6 more pages. Damien and Vanessa had a proper conversation, the kind they had been carefully avoiding, on Thursday evening at her apartment. It was not a fight. It was worse than a fight. Vanessa sat across from him and spoke quietly and honestly, which was Vanessa at her most devastating, and she said that since the dinner at the restaurant she had been thinking about something she had been not thinking about for a long time. She said the moment he had spoken to the waitress in that language, she had understood something about him that she had been willfully misreading for over a year. She was not angry. That, Damien thought, was the most terrifying part. Vanessa said, "You were so certain she wouldn't understand you. That's what I keep coming back to. The certainty. You weren't trying to be witty or playful, you were trying to make her feel small. And the fact that she didn't, the fact that she knew more than you, I watched your face. And I didn't like what I saw." Damien started to respond and she held up her hand gently and he stopped, which was unusual. She said, "I've been unfair to myself. I've been choosing the performance of you over the reality of you, and I think we both deserve better than that." She gave him back the ring that evening. It was quiet and dignified and genuinely sad, which made it worse than any version of this conversation he had run in his head. He drove home alone and sat in his car outside his building for 20 minutes. He was not a man prone to self-reflection. His whole life had been structured to avoid it, but in that car, in the dark, something shifted. He thought about what Vanessa had said about the certainty. He thought about the waitress's face, calm, unhurried, right? And he thought about his own, and he did not like the comparison. He went upstairs and poured a drink and did not call anyone, which was unusual. Damien Cole, for perhaps the first time in years, had nothing to perform for and no one to perform it to. It was a very uncomfortable feeling. He suspected it might be honest. The academic trust connected Imani for an application interview within the week. Elias had made the introduction but, true to his word, had stepped back completely. The process was hers, the work was hers, and when she walked into the interview panel, there was no special treatment apparent beyond the door being open. She sat before 3 faculty evaluators and answered questions about her research for 90 minutes. She was the best version of herself she had been in 2 years. Not performing, not surviving, just thinking out loud with people who were capable of keeping up. When the lead evaluator told her that her preliminary chapters were, and she quoted directly, "among the most rigorous methodological work we've reviewed from a re-entry candidate," Imani felt something unlock in her chest that she hadn't realized was still locked. The re-entry funding decision would take several weeks, but the tone of the interview left little doubt. Meanwhile, one of Elias's companies had been in touch with a consulting offer. Language analysis and document interpretation, project-based, the kind of flexible arrangement that could run alongside doctoral work. The money was real and the work was genuinely interesting, and it was, she noted with a quiet private amusement, something she could do from anywhere, including between shifts at the restaurant if she needed to. She had not decided yet whether she would stay at the restaurant. Part of her wanted to. She had come to feel a kind of ownership over that place, a belonging born of showing up with dignity every day when dignity was not being offered in return. Kezia picked up on the change in Imani before Imani said anything. "You're different," she said during a slow Tuesday afternoon. "Good different." Imani smiled. "Things are moving." Kezia studied her. "The man with the card?" Imani nodded. Kezia leaned on the counter. "Is he?" Imani shook her head quickly. "It's not like that. He's a mentor. He's someone who sees clearly." Kezia nodded slowly. "Okay. But also," she glanced at Imani with a small knowing smile, "is he handsome though?" Imani laughed. It was a full, real laugh, the kind that surprised her by how good it felt. "That is completely beside the point," she said. Kezia said, "So yes." Damien spent 2 weeks doing something he rarely did: nothing. He went to work because work was automatic, but he cleared his social calendar and did not replace it and let the space sit. He had been running on adrenaline and performance and relentless forward motion for so long that stillness felt like a malfunction. But something Vanessa had said had lodged in him and he couldn't remove it. "You were so certain she wouldn't understand you." He turned it over the way he turned over business problems, looking for the thing underneath it. And gradually, uncomfortably, he found it. He had needed her to be less. He had built the whole moment on the assumption of her limitation. That was not sophistication. That was fear. He made inquiries. Not to the restaurant. That road was closed and he knew it, especially given what had recently surfaced about the HR complaint review, news of which had reached him through a business associate who was on the restaurant group's board. He made inquiries more generally, asking in roundabout ways about the waitress who had known old Provençal, the one who had corrected him in front of a dining room. He expected the trail to be short. It was not. What came back, through a researcher he used for due diligence, was a profile that stopped him in his seat. Doctoral candidate. Language scholar. Published in 2 academic journals before she was 25. Left a prestigious program 2 years ago for undisclosed personal reasons. He sat with that information for a long time. He thought about the question he had asked her, "What are you doing here?" And the way she had answered it. "Taking your order." He understood now, with a clarity that was not comfortable, how small his version of that question had been. How much it had said about him and how little it had asked about her. He found himself wanting to say something, not to fix anything because he understood that some things don't get fixed by the person who broke them, but because the discomfort of having been wrong and said nothing about it was beginning to feel worse than the vulnerability of acknowledging it. The corporate HR review concluded with a full withdrawal of the formal warning. Adrian called Imani personally to inform her and to express, in careful professional language, the company's regret about how the situation had been handled. Gerald, Imani learned through Kezia, had been placed on a performance review of his own. Damien Cole's patronage, quietly and without fanfare, had been declined going forward, a decision made by the restaurant group's board that was never announced but was clean and final. Imani listened to Adrienne's call standing in her kitchen with her coffee going cold on the counter, and when she hung up she stood still for a moment and then said, quietly and to no one in particular, "Okay." She returned to her next shift and worked it the same way she worked every shift, with precision and warmth and the complete attention she brought to whatever she was doing. But something had changed in how the room received her. Gerald looked at her with a mixture of chastened respect and obvious discomfort. Her co-workers had heard enough through the reliable channel of restaurant gossip to know that she had fought something and won it, and there was a different quality of acknowledgement in how people made room for her in the kitchen, how they saved her the good coffee. Kezia simply hugged her when she arrived without explaining why, and Imani let herself be hugged. After her shift that evening, Elias sent a brief text. "Heard the review went your way. Well done." She texted back, "Thank you for paying attention." He replied, "You did all of it." She sat with that for a while on the bus ride home. She thought about the 2 years she had spent making herself small, not because she was, but because the circumstances had demanded it, and what it had cost her and what it had also quietly and unexpectedly built. She had not broken. She had documented. She had rebutted. She had opened a dissertation folder at midnight when she was exhausted and written anyway. The uniform had never been the truth of her. She had always known that. But now other people were beginning to know it too. Damien reached out through a mutual business contact. someone who knew Elias Fontaine, and asked if there was a way to pass a message to the woman from the restaurant. The contact found this unusual and said so. Damien said simply that he owed someone an apology and preferred to not deliver it uninvited or directly. The contact told Elias. Elias told Imani without any editorial comment, presenting it as information she could use however she chose. Imani thought about it for 2 days. Then she told Elias she was willing to hear what Damien had to say, in a neutral setting at a time of her choosing, and that she reserved the right to leave at any moment. They met at a coffee shop on a Tuesday afternoon. Not the restaurant, not anywhere associated with either of their professional lives, just a quiet, ordinary place. Damien arrived first. He was sitting with his hands around his coffee cup when Imani walked in, and she noticed immediately that he looked different. Not diminished exactly but less armored. He stood when she approached the table, which surprised her. She sat down. He did not launch into anything. He looked at her for a moment and then said, "I was deliberately cruel to you. I used a language I spent months learning specifically to humiliate someone who I assumed wouldn't understand it. And I was wrong, not just about you but about the whole impulse. I want to say I'm sorry." Imani listened to the full apology. He did not make excuses. He did not explain what he had been going through with Vanessa, or frame his behavior as anything other than what it was. She respected that. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I appreciate that. I genuinely do. What you did cost me more than you know, not just the one moment but the repercussions that followed. But I also need you to understand that the person you tried to humiliate had already survived harder things than your opinion of her." Damien nodded slowly. She continued, "I don't need you to feel bad indefinitely. But I do need you to understand that what you assumed about me and what you tried to use against me, it said nothing about me. It said everything about what you were afraid of." The table was quiet. Damien looked at his coffee. He said, "I know." After the meeting with Damien, Imani walked for a long time. She walked without a destination, through streets busy with the ordinary motion of people who did not know her story and had no idea what she was carrying, and she thought about all of it, every piece, from the moment she had withdrawn from her program to the moment she had looked at Damien Cole across his dinner menu and known exactly what he had said and known exactly what she would do about it. She did not feel triumphant. She felt something quieter and more durable than triumph. She felt like herself. She called her father that evening and told him, all of it, the formal warning, the HR review, the re-entry funding interview, Elias, and the meeting with Damien, while she made dinner in her small kitchen. Her father listened the way he had always listened, with that specific patient attention that had made her feel heard even when she was small and her problems were small. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Baby, I need you to listen to me carefully." She said, "I'm listening." He said, "I am so proud of you that I don't have the words for it. And I need you to promise me that from now on, you keep writing. Whatever happens, you keep writing." She felt her throat tighten. "I promise," she said. The re-entry funding came through 10 days later. Full reinstatement. Tuition covered. A housing supplement. A formal faculty letter from her original advisor, who had never stopped hoping she would return, welcoming her back and asking if she would be willing to present at a departmental seminar on her recent progress. She read the email standing at the restaurant service station between the lunch and dinner rush, and she had to breathe very carefully for about 30 seconds to keep herself composed. And then she tucked her phone back into her apron pocket and went to table 4 with their soup and was absolutely professional about it. But her hands were trembling slightly and Kezia, who noticed everything, caught her eye across the room and raised her eyebrows, and Imani gave the smallest possible nod, and Kezia pressed both hands over her mouth to keep from making a noise. She gave the restaurant her notice the following week. She worked her remaining 2 weeks with the same integrity she had brought to every shift, and on her last night the kitchen staff made her a cake. A real one, not a restaurant pretty one, and Kezia gave a short speech that was approximately 40% heartfelt and 60% funny, which was exactly right. Gerald shook her hand and said he hoped she knew he had been in an impossible position, and Imani said she understood, which was true. Understanding something and being hurt by it were not mutually exclusive, but she was not a person who needed Gerald to be destroyed in order to move forward. She had what she needed from that place. She left at the end of the night and stood on the pavement outside and breathed the cool air and felt the specific lightness of a chapter ending. Elias met her for coffee again the following Saturday. Their meetings had become, over the past weeks, a kind of quiet regularity, not formal, not exactly social, something in between. He asked how she felt about leaving. She said it felt like taking off a coat she'd been wearing in a warm room for too long. He smiled at that. She asked him directly, because she had decided she was done not asking direct questions, why he had taken an interest in her specifically. He thought about it for a moment and then said, "Because when I watched you walk out of that manager's office, you were the only person in that building who knew exactly who you were. That's rarer than talent. Rarer than intelligence. I wanted to make sure the world didn't lose it." She looked at him. He looked back without any embarrassment. Neither of them said anything for a moment. She returned to her doctoral program on the first Monday of the following month. She walked through the campus with her bag on her shoulder and her leather notebook in her hand, and she felt, all at once and without warning, the full weight of the 2 years she had been away, and the full joy of standing exactly where she was supposed to be. Her advisor met her at the door of the department and hugged her, which was unexpected and completely welcome. Her desk was exactly as she had left it. Someone had kept the plant on her windowsill alive, which made her laugh and also, briefly and privately, cry. She sat down, opened her files and began to write. 6 months later, Imani defended her dissertation. The panel was rigorous and exacting, and she met every question with the fluency of someone who had been living inside the material for years, which she had, all of it, including the 2 years in the restaurant, where she had been sharpening herself without knowing she was doing it. The committee deliberated for 45 minutes, which felt like a geological epoch, and then called her back in and told her she had passed with distinction. There was a moment, just before they said the words, where she looked at the window and thought of her father, and her sisters and Kezia, and the folded leather notebook, and a Tuesday afternoon coffee shop where a man had apologized in full sentences, and a quieter man who had left a card in a check folder and changed the direction of her life. She thought of all of it in the span of a breath. Her father came to the small celebration dinner that evening, still moving carefully but moving and more present every month. He sat at the head of the table and looked at her the entire meal with an expression she had no words for and did not need any. Kezia was there, loud and glorious and wearing an outfit that was genuinely alarming in the best possible way. Elias came briefly, stayed for one glass of something sparkling, said very little and left early, which was exactly his style and which she had come to find deeply, specifically comforting. Before he left, he said simply, "Well done, Dr. Carter." She heard her title for the first time from another person's voice. She let it land. Months later, when a journalist writing about re-entry scholars and academic research asked Imani if there was a single moment she could point to as the turning point, she thought about it carefully and then answered honestly. She said it was a dinner shift. She said a man had spoken to her in a language he assumed she didn't know, designed to make her feel like nothing. She said she had responded, in the same language with a correction, and the room had gone quiet, and in that quiet she had remembered, completely and without any further question, exactly who she was. The journalist asked what language. Imani smiled. "An old one," she said. "Most people don't know it. But I did."